From Iran to Ukraine to the South Caucasus, is Russia really gaining leverage across conflicts or getting pulled into a wider strategic trap? Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Conversations on Groong episode. Stay with us for a very interesting discussion with Dr. Dmitry Suslov today. He is a Russian political scientist, foreign policy analyst, and commentator specializing in the great power politics of Russia, Russia-US relations, and European security, also the evolving international order.
And folks, this episode is being recorded on April 24, 2026. And we want to express, of course, our sympathy to Armenians who are commemorating the Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day today. And on behalf of Groong, I just want to say that we, of course, remember, but more importantly, we demand and we will continue demanding until historic justice is returned to Armenians.
And Hovig, let me just say, not only sympathy, our full solidarity as two Armenians with our causes.
And before we go to the discussion very quickly, if you're just joining us, if you just found us on YouTube, please make sure you're subscribed. It helps us a lot. But also like, comment, and share this content with your friends and everywhere you can so that we can get seen by more people. And of course, if you feel really generous, you can help us monetarily by going to podcast.groong.org/donate. Thank you very much for that. And without further ado, on with the show.
Dr. Dmitry Suslov, welcome to the Groong podcast.
My pleasure. Hello.
Welcome, Dr. Suslov. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much.
Let's jump straight into our first topic. The war on Iran has moved into an unstable pause rather than any kind of a resolution. A fragile ceasefire is in place, but it is being violated on multiple fronts and all the time, while the U.S. naval blockade and Iran's countermoves in the Strait of Hormuz keep tensions high and global trade disrupted. At the same time, both sides retain the capacity to escalate quickly, and negotiations are ongoing but appearing far from any kind of a durable settlement. From your vantage point in Moscow, what is your outlook on this war on Iran?
Well, I think that this fragile peace or the situation of no peace, no war will continue for a while. I'm quite skeptical on the ability of the United States and Iran to find a mutually acceptable solution, or as Trump says, forever peace for all time. I think that the positions of the sides are diametrically opposite and very difficult to be reconciled, or at least quickly. Iran basically de facto won this conflict, and of course, it's very difficult for the United States to accept it. Today, the position of the policy of the United States seems to be, to try to coerce Iran into a settlement that could be acceptable for the United States through economic pressure. Through the economic exhaustion of Iran by actually the naval blockade, and at the same time to try to facilitate the internal fractions and contradictions within Iran, the quarrels between the so-called liberals and so-called conservatives within the Iranian leadership. So on the one hand, the United States is offering some economic incentives, stimulating the liberals. On the other hand, it is imposing this naval blockade. But my sense is that Iran has huge resilience potential, right? And Iran can sustain much more pain than the global economy, which suffers from the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, and the regional allies and partners of the United States, the Arab Gulf monarchies. So there is a fight, basically, who will blink first, who will make movements first as a result of that economic suffering. Iran thinks, and Iran is convinced, that time is on its side. The United States hopes that, with internal contradictions and economic troubles within Iran will compel it to show some flexibility, more flexibility at the negotiation table. And when both sides believe that time is on its side, it is not an incentive for a quick peace and not a precondition for a quick peace. At the same time, the options of the United States are very limited because a resumption of war actually is not in the interests of the United States. It could be in the interests of Israel, but not in the interests of the United States or the Trump administration. The United States will achieve nothing through the resumption of the war. It will just hurt more the American position, the domestic political position of Donald Trump and Republicans in the United States, who are already suffering hugely, and also the Arab allies, the Arab monarchies of the Gulf.
You mentioned that Iran has de facto won this war. If this is the case, does the U.S. failure in Iran weaken the kind of leverage that it has on Ukraine?
Absolutely. Well, I think that Iran generally, that this Iran situation or the outcome of the Iranian conflict weakens the United States globally, weakens the American position vis-a-vis all its allies and partners in the Middle East, in Asia Pacific, and also in Europe. And it weakens the global standing and domestic political standing of Donald Trump and the Trump administration, which, as you rightly said, and that's a problem, and that's one of the negative outcomes of this situation for Russia, one of the disadvantages for Russia, is that weakening of the United States and weakening of Donald Trump decreases even more its leverage vis-a-vis Ukraine and vis-a-vis Europe. More than half a year passed since the Anchorage summit between Trump and Putin. And even when Trump's position was stronger, the United States turned out to be unable to deliver the implementation of the of the summit outcomes, right? Namely, the US was unable to deliver the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the remaining part of Donbass, which they still control. And in the situation of weakened Trump, in the situation of the crisis of transatlantic relations, the chances that Donald Trump would be able to convince Kiev and Europe to accept this condition, to accept this term, is even less, right? This is why we are much less hopeful and much more pessimistic about the negotiated settlement of the Ukraine conflict in conditions of the weakening of the United States and Donald Trump.
We'll talk more about Ukraine in just a moment. I have a couple more questions about Iran. There are reports that Iran has granted free passage for friendly countries. I say,
Right.
quote, friendly countries through the Straits of Hormuz. Are Russian ships able to sail through the Straits today?
Well, I don't think that Russian ships actually transport the Middle Eastern oil and other resources through the Persian Gulf. We export our Russian oil through other means, and through the Russian ports. But my judgment is that the Strait of Hormuz is de facto blocked completely today because Iran blocks and prohibits all the movement not authorized by Iran. And the United States blocks all the movement which is authorized by Iran, right? So, and this ultimately results into the complete and total blockade of the strait, which is extremely disastrous for the world economy and for the Arab Gulf countries who are unable to export their resources now through the Persian Gulf. The only remaining opportunity for them is the Red Sea, actually, and the Suez Channel, which again could be blocked by the Houthis. And if the United States resumes the war, the strikes against Iran, let alone if the United States tries to escalate this war, it is most likely that the Houthis will block the Red Sea too, and then the complete Middle Eastern region will be out of the global economy and of the global energy, which will result into an energy crisis much more severe and much deeper than the one in 1970.
Dr. Suslov, coming back to the Iran war, actually, I want to talk a little bit about what people call the Northern Front, Iran, Azerbaijan, Turkey. Of course, there's also Armenia. And you might recall that early in the war, there were some drone attacks on the exclave Nakhichevan. And of course, some people claim that those originated from Iran, and that led to a huge amount of acrimony between Aliyev and Iran. And then suddenly, just within 2 or 3 days, the whole thing disappeared, and Aliyev was sending humanitarian aid to Iran. But I'm sure that this issue was just shuffled under the rug and has not disappeared. And some analysts believe that if the situation should devolve in the Iran war and some kind of a ground attack becomes an option for the West, there's going to be a role for Azerbaijan and possibly even Turkey to play. What do you think is going on this front? And under what conditions could there suddenly be an engagement on the part of Turkey and Azerbaijan against Iran?
Well, first, I'm absolutely convinced that the chances for a land invasion in Iran are negligible because they will bring nothing but huge troubles for the invaders, namely for the United States or the countries who could hypothetically participate in that land invasion. The United States simply lacks the material resources, including the people, for a full-fledged invasion. Iran is a 90 million people country, right? That would require huge accumulation of manpower for a land invasion. Whereas a limited invasion, there were speculations about, for instance, occupation of the island of Khark,
Right.
or the maritime region, the coastline of Iran. It will bring absolutely nothing from the military perspective. It will just bring even more destruction for the Arab Gulf countries and even more casualties. Actually, that would bring a lot of casualties for the United States. Iran will not capitulate at all as a result of this limited land operation. On the contrary, Iran will double down on retaliation and on the military damage, on the damage that Iran will inflict on the region as a whole, right? So the damage for the whole region will increase without bringing the desired outcomes for the United States. This is actually why Trump does not want a land operation, and I think he makes it quite clear. As for that episode with drones and the speculations about the northern front, I'm absolutely sure that it was an Israeli provocation. Because it happened in the earlier stages of that war when the outcome was not clear yet. Right now we know that Iran basically survived. And this is the major Iranian victory. This is why I say that Iran basically prevailed in this war, because Iran stayed, Iran survived, it did not capitulate, and it compelled basically the United States to halt the military operation. That's victory. But in the beginning of that conflict, it was not clear whether Iran would survive or not, right? And in those conditions, to open other fronts, and to draw the other neighboring countries into attacking Iran seemed completely foolish from the Iranian perspective. So Iran could not do that. The country which was interested in multiplicating the fronts and in bringing more countries in against Iran, basically these were Israel and the United States. Right, and they were much more interested in engaging Azerbaijan against Iran than Iran itself. So I believe that it was an operation under false flag, as it is called. But when it became clear that it was not Iran behind that, and basically Turkey was not interested in the spillover of this war into the South Caucasus and
Yeah, that's
Azerbaijan.
right.
Then there was this stabilization, and as you rightly said, the Azerbaijani president started to send humanitarian aid to Iran instead of the land invasion,
Missiles. Yeah.
right,
Um,
or missiles.
Dr. Suslov, we hear a lot about Russia's strategic partnership with Iran. Of course, Russia and China are viewed as the main partners of Iran. How much military cooperation and support is ongoing between Iran and Russia? We hear differing opinions on this. And also, in terms of China, we hear that China right now is pushing very hard to tamper down or to restrict Iranian responses and hopefully push it towards negotiations. What is the role of Russia and China at this stage of the conflict?
Well, Russia is also interested in settlement and not interested in the resumption of war. On the one hand, tactically, Russia is benefiting from this situation economically as well, because the demand on Russian oil is increasing, the oil prices are increasing, Russia is getting more profits, getting more money, and the United States is compelled to extend this pause on the sanctions against the Russian oil. Uh, However, in the longer term prospect, if there is a long term crisis, if this situation is not resolved for months, there is a big chance, a big risk of a world economic crisis, of world economic recession, basically. And this world economic recession will hurt Russia much, right? Because Russia is quite economically fragile. Russia is very much dependent on the conjuncture of world economy. The world economic recession or the world economic depression will again bring the oil prices down because the demand will fall, and Russia will suffer. Russia will suffer. So strategically, Russia is not interested in endless continuation of that conflict. So China, of course, is suffering already now. Many other Asian countries like Philippines and Indonesia and Pakistan are suffering even more because already now they are feeling the shortage, the deficit of oil and gasoline as a result. So Russia and China are trying to facilitate the negotiations. Russia is offering itself as a mediator, as a potential mediator. The same refers to China, and so on and so forth. As for our relations with Iran, yes, of course, Iran is our strategic partner. And to tell the truth, we are very happy that Iran survived after that war, because the collapse of Islamic Republic of Iran, chaos in Iran would hurt Russian interests hugely, right? Russia would have been cut off from the potential access to the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, and the implementation of the North-South corridor would be under question, and so on and so forth. So, of course, Iran is our partner, privileged partner, and we have robust cooperation with Iran. However, we are not providing direct military help, direct military assistance to Iran now, because we do not want to antagonize the United States, right? It is absolutely obvious that if Russia had provided military help to Iran now in its fight against the United States most likely could provide military aid to Ukraine, could, in retaliation, could return to providing military aid to Ukraine. We are not interested in that, right? We're interested in restraint of the United States vis-a-vis Ukraine, which is much more important for us. So we are also restraintful in our assistance to Iran. There were speculations about Russia providing intel information to Iran. I do not know, of course, the information on that. But I would not be surprised if Russia had done it. Because basically we know that the United States is already providing intel information to Ukraine, and the Trump administration continued to do that. So perhaps Russia could mirror this
Tit for tat.
this approach, tit for tat, absolutely, but not providing weapons. Because the direct provision of weapons is something that the United States is not doing vis-a-vis Ukraine right now. Iran is not the only Russian partner in the Middle East. We have very good partnership relations with the Arab Gulf countries. You know, United Arab Emirates is the member of BRICS. Saudi Arabia is also a strategic partner of Russia, and we are interested in sustaining this balance between Iran on the one hand and Arab Gulf countries on the other hand. We do not want to antagonize them by assisting Iran too much, right? Of course, our sympathy in the conflict between Iran and the United States is at the Iranian side, because we consider Iran to be a victim which was attacked without provocation and so on and so forth, right? Illegal, immoral invasion and so on. But in the conflict between Iran and the Arab Gulf countries, we are at no one's side, right? We don't want to take any kind of position, right? And we also try to convince Iran not to overreact in the Iranian retaliation against the American attacks from the territories of the Arab Gulf countries, right? Because again, we want to continue to sustain our balanced partnership with Iran on the one hand, and the Arab Gulf monarchies on the other hand.
That makes sense.
Dr. Suslov, let's turn our attention back to Ukraine for a little while. If you listen to Russian leaders and Russian media, there's continuous progress every day. There are announcements of new villages and new land being taken. There's also analysts who say that is basically a grinding attrition, and there's no clear sign of a breakthrough in the war in Ukraine. How would you describe the current state? What's your outlook? And also, do you see like how this war will end in Ukraine?
Oh, that's a very difficult question.
Yeah.
First, I completely agree that it is the war of attrition. The nature of the warfare has fundamentally changed due to the massive introduction of drones. You know, today you cannot conduct the classic maneuver warfare, and it is not a maneuver warfare. You know, the every square meter is observed and destroyed. You know, any movement of manpower or of people, and especially of the armor, is immediately noticed and destroyed by drones, right? The front line looks like a kill zone, basically. 20 roughly it is the 20 kilometers kill zone. So this explains the very slow pace of the Russian offensive. You simply cannot, you know, physically, you cannot proceed quicker due to this massive presence of drones for observation and also for destruction. So this is indeed the war of attrition. And the outcome of this war will be determined by which side collapses first. You know, and we are talking about the collapse not necessarily of the front line, but the internal collapse. You know, something like what happened with the German Empire in 1918, right? Germany was basically winning; it was not losing at the front line. But then the internal collapse resulted into the German defeat in the First World War. So we are talking about which side will exhaust itself to the critical point first. Russia has an advantage in manpower, you know, and basically the manpower deficit is the major weakness of Ukraine. Also, Ukraine is at the external life support. the economic sustainability of Ukraine is provided by Europe, right? And to continue this topic about the war of attrition, basically we are no longer talking about the Russian-Ukrainian war. We are talking about a Russia-Europe war right now, right? And this has become a Russia-Europe war because the Ukrainian, what matters most in the war of attrition is the rear. It is not the front line, it is the rear. Right? The economy, the population, the production, the logistics, and so on and so forth, the rear. And the Ukrainian rear is not Ukraine. The Ukrainian rear is Europe, which is providing Ukraine with everything, right? So that explains this stalemate which exists today, right? But the fundamental difference is that Russian resilience is determined by Russia. Ukrainian resilience is determined by Europe.
So in this context, is Russia prepared for a long-term strategic conflict with Europe? Because that's what it's going towards. And especially in the context of this hot war, essentially Russia has retooled its economy to be on a military footing all the time. How long can Russia sustain its economy and industry, especially as it's geared towards the war?
Well, on your latest question, the economists are saying that Russia can continue the current war of attrition for a couple of years more without a severe domestic economic crisis. So we still have resources to do that. As for a Russia-Europe conflict, this conflict is already ongoing. Right? The major reason for the continuation of the war is Europe. The major party which is basically rejecting the terms of peace offered by the Trump administration is Europe. The major party which is sustaining Ukraine economically and militarily is Europe. So we are already in this confrontation with Europe. The question is, will this confrontation spill over into the direct hot war between Russia and Europe or not? Or at which stage will this confrontation spill over into the hot war, direct military clash between Russia and Europe? And unfortunately, the risks of this direct military confrontation, the combat, or at least missile strikes between Russia and Europe directly increased in the recent times because the volume of the European participation, I would say, in this direct participation in this war has increased. Right? There are multiple joint access enterprises between Ukraine and Europe, which jointly produce drones. Right? I already said that drones is today the major arm, right? The major weapon used at this war, both at the front line and also for deep strikes into the rear of each other. And now Europe is increasing the volume of drones supplied to Ukraine, and we are talking about hundreds of thousands of drones annually, which will allow Ukraine to hit Russia with roughly 1,500 drones, European-produced drones, right? European-produced drones daily. And that's a problem, right? That's a big problem. And basically, the only way for Russia is to prevent the production and the provision. The production is already ongoing, but the provision of those drones to Ukraine. So Russia has already started to claim that if this provision of drones is ongoing, Russia will probably have no other alternative than to use direct military force against those enterprises in European countries, which means direct Russian missile attacks against Germany, against France, against Italy, against UK, right, and the other European countries which produce those drones for Ukraine. And again, this is the war of attrition, right? And the Ukrainian attrition is the chances of Ukraine to survive this attrition is provided by Europe. Ukraine and Europe conduct assaults against the Russian rear. So why shouldn't Russia conduct assaults against the Ukrainian rear, which is not Ukraine per se, but Europe? But we are in a very dangerous territory now, right? Because if Russia comes to that point when it will hit enterprises in the territories of European countries, we are talking about Third World War with very quick chances of the nuclear escalation.
Dr. Suslov, you mentioned a little earlier that the conflict continues to depend on one side on Russian decisions and on the other side, EU decisions. And of course, the EU usually needs 28 countries to agree on a direction. And while its leadership is full of rabid anti-Russian people, like Kaja Kallas and other people who just, one directional, that cohesion was stopped by Viktor Orban. They could never quite agree to move completely anti-Russian. Has the loss of the prime ministership, the elections in Hungary by Viktor Orban, changed any of the calculus that Russia has regarding EU's cohesion and decision-making ability to continue this war?
Not necessarily, because I would not overestimate the factor of Viktor Orban as a stumbling block for the EU anti-Russian policy and decisions. Under with Viktor Orban's participation, European Union has adopted 19 packages of anti-Russian sanctions, and only the 20th was adopted after Viktor Orban. So come on, I mean, nothing prevented Viktor Orban from ultimately voting yes in favor of those sanctions, right? And also, Viktor Orban blocked the provision of the 90 billion euro credit to Ukraine, not because he didn't want the European Union to provide this credit, but because Ukraine was blackmailing Hungary with the cutoff of the oil. Of the Russian oil through the Druzhba pipeline. And nothing changed after Orban, basically, right? The new Hungarian, or the future Hungarian, the pending Hungarian Prime Minister, Peter Magyar, also rejects the Hungarian participation in the provision of that 90 billion euro credit to Ukraine. And he also claims that Hungary will continue to be dependent on the Russian oil. Ukraine switched off that pipeline after the defeat of Viktor Orban. Hungary, and now it is still Orban's government, right? But Hungary removed the veto on the provision of that credit, of the EU credit to Ukraine. At the same time, we see that Magyar, the new Hungarian prime minister, is also national-oriented, right? He also wants to promote the Hungarian national interests more in cooperation with the EU institutions rather than in confrontation with the EU institutions. So his methodologically, his methods could be different from Orban, but not the strategy, right? Not the fundamentals. Also, we see that in Bulgaria, a national-oriented and considered to be pro-Russian leader and political party won. So basically, I do not see a fundamental difference and a fundamental change in the European Union, right? And the point is that the institutions of the European Union and the leading countries of the European Union, Germany and France, are still controlled by the anti-Russian elites, and the anti-Russian policy remains to be the consolidating factor for the European Union plus United Kingdom.
So I'm going to turn a little bit to Russian foreign policy towards the South Caucasus,
Right.
Armenia. And earlier this month, as we all know, Nikol Pashinyan's visit to Moscow turned quite tense with a rare public exchange, heated public exchange between him and Vladimir Putin, followed by pointed warnings from the Russian officials over Armenia's pro-EU and pro-West pivot. Moscow signaled possible consequences, including the loss of cheap gas, constraints on the future of the Armenian nuclear power plant, and broader economic pressure. Officials also framed the TRIPP, the Trump route, as a challenge to the regional order in place since 1828. It was interesting to note how far back Russia's foreign policy thinks about the regional order stemming from, like, the Turkmenchai Treaty. Despite this, Pashinyan presented the visit to the Armenian public as constructive and good, and said that he plans a follow-up summit with Putin after, I think he's expecting to win the June elections. Now, is it possible that Russia could eventually agree to some kind of a long period of neither here nor there policy by Pashinyan, especially if he manages to maintain power after June 7? We've heard from people like Alexander Lukashenko that Armenia can no longer sit on two chairs. What do you
Well,
think?
from the Russian perspective, it is not a policy of neither here nor there. It is the policy of deliberate movement towards the West, step by step reorientation towards the European Union, and step by step phasing out of the remaining cooperation and alliance with Russia. Of course, Pashinyan does not want to cut relations with Russia immediately like that because he doesn't have alternatives right now, right? He wants a phased and long process of managed reduction of the relations with Russia. That's the
Right.
point, right? And Pashinyan thinks, and the current Armenian leadership think that they will control and manage this process of step-by-step reduction or phasing out of political, military, economic, and so on relations with Russia. Right? They cannot afford to withdraw from the Eurasian Economic Union now, but they could do it later on at a certain stage, and no question they want to do it later on at a certain point, then when they hope they will have the alternatives. Now they cannot afford to demand the withdrawal of the Russian military base from Gyumri because they do not have the alternatives, right? Because there is still no peace treaty with Azerbaijan, because the relations with Turkey are still troublesome, and so on and so forth. And they have no alternatives in terms of the security guarantees. But they hope to acquire those alternative security guarantees, and as soon as they do it, the Russian military base will be out. Right, and so on. So Pashinyan thinks that he can control that process of the reduction of relations. And the major point of Putin's and Averchuk's, the deputy prime minister responsible for the Eurasian economic integration, who made those statements, the point which the Russian side made during that visit was, no, you will not control that process, right? That we also have agency in the Russian-Armenian relations, right? And we can accelerate certain things, not waiting for Armenian gradual reorientation to the European Union and broadly to the West. Of course, Russia is not interested in the destruction of the remnants of Russian-Armenian relations, right? We are interested in the preservation of our military presence. We're interested in Armenian membership in the Eurasian Economic Union, and so on and so forth, right? But we are not interested in that as an interim measure, to make the Armenian reorientation more comfortable. Come on, right? We are
Right.
not interested.
Well, I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. So this is why basically Russia made this statement, right? That Armenia has to decide. if Armenia is moving towards the European Union, which is de facto at war with Russia, by the way, right? Today, not even the United States, but the European Union is the major Russian adversary, including military adversary, political adversary, economic adversary, and so on and so forth. This is one nature of the Russian-Armenian relations. If Armenia is an ally and partner, it's another nature of Russian-Armenian relations, and Armenia has to decide. Russia does not want to, cut the diversification of Armenian foreign policy. By the way, Russia does not want to restrict Armenia from diversifying its foreign relations. Of course, Armenia is welcome to cooperate with the United States, to cooperate with the European Union, to cooperate with Turkey, with whomever you like, right? But what Russia is against of is this reorientation, which includes the degradation of Russian-Armenian relations, right? Because the Armenian government is not just building relations with Europe. It is explicitly replacing one relations with the other relations. But it is doing that in a slow, step-by-step managed process to make it more comfortable for the current Armenian government. So Russia is not willing to do that. The counter argument, which we often hear from our Armenian friends who support that policy, is come on, Armenia will not join the European Union in years and maybe decades, so Russia shouldn't be worried. But look, we see what is happening with the countries who proclaim their will to join the European Union. European Union demands that those countries synchronize their foreign policy with the one of the Brussels long before their accession into the European Union, right? Georgia is also very far from joining the European Union, as well as Serbia. But already now European Union demands those countries who proclaim membership in the EU as their strategic choice, that they reject their national foreign policy and adopt EU foreign policy as their national foreign policy.
It's a very exclusive
that will also happen
relationship
with
as well.
Armenia.
Yeah.
Sorry?
It's a very exclusive relationship demand as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Dr. Suslov, so despite the narratives by Pashinyan, of course, fully supported by state media in Armenia and their Western and EU puppet masters, in my opinion, Armenians are currently in a state of dysphoria, stemming from the war, the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh. It is a big burden to bear on the shoulders. On top of this, we are hearing about plans for more capitulation by Pashinyan. We're talking about the church, the constitution, and essentially the core of Armenian identity is on the chopping block. To many of us, and I don't mean to dilute or demean the Russian experience, but this is as bad as the experience of Nazis in 1941 in USSR, where Armenians also, suffered along with the Russians. And Azerbaijan is even pushing its own idea of Lebensraum with this Western Azerbaijan concept. So the truth is that the majority of Armenians simply, I would say, want dignity. And this is what will motivate Armenians in the June elections to vote for the opposition and not Pashinyan. Meanwhile, Pashinyan, of course, is labeling anyone who is in the opposition and anyone who doesn't sign up to his plan of capitulation to Azerbaijan as revanchists. So this hope of dignity, again, I'm going to go, maybe it's emotional, but I'm going to go back to that. If the Armenian opposition has these hopes, and if the opposition wins in these elections, of course, I'm not asking you to go into details about Armenian politics, but from a perspective of Russia, we see that Russia wants to balance its relations with Azerbaijan. And in my opinion, I don't think this dignity will be restored without military balance in the region. So what is Russia prepared to do to restore military balance in case a more friendly government comes to power?
Well, first, I think that the narrative promoted by the current Armenian government that a victory of the current opposition would automatically bring war is absolutely false. There are no grounds for that at all. I strongly doubt that a hypothetical government led by opposition would want to reconquer something that Armenia tragically lost as a result of the second Karabakh war. Moreover, the situation is absolutely contrary to what Nikol Pashinyan and the current Armenian government is saying, right? Because the major guarantor of peace is deterrence. You rightly said the Azerbaijani speculations about the Western Armenia, and so on and so forth, right? They want the direct access to Turkey. They want a corridor controlled by Azerbaijan through the current territory of Armenia, and so on and so forth.
And they're, of course,
So,
also saying that 300,000 Azerbaijanis need to come to Armenia. That's also, I think not too distant in the plans.
absolutely, absolutely. And the policy of appeasement, which is currently conducted by the Pashinyan government, because what he's doing is appeasement in the 1930s understanding of this term, will not bring peace. It will undermine peace because he also ruins the deterrence. Come on, Europe will not provide deterrence to Armenia vis-a-vis Azerbaijan and Turkey. Neither France nor United States nor ever. The only factor which is at the Armenian side, which is providing deterrence, is Russia plus Iran. By the way, another country interested in the survival of Armenia is Iran. And what is the current government of Armenia doing? It is destroying the relations with Russia and also destroying the relations with Iran. So for nothing, right? Which limits which weakens the deterrence, and by weakening the deterrence, it increases the chances for a renewed Azerbaijani aggression against Armenia. So if the opposition wins, the policy of appeasement will stop, but the policy of peace, I think, will strengthen from the side of Armenia. We expect the opposition also to normalize and strengthen relations with Russia without breaking relations with Europe and the United States, because, of course, Armenia is welcome to continue partnership with the United States and Europe. Partnership, not integration, right? Partnership with Europe and the United States. Russia is fully committed to preserving its military presence in Armenia, the Gyumri military base. Also, Russia is interested to continue supplying Armenia with arms and weapons. And look, the war in Ukraine will end sooner or later because there are no forever wars, right? I mean, I do not expect that war to last 5 years more or something like that, right? It will end definitely sooner. We don't know exactly when, but it will definitely end. And when the war in Ukraine ends, Russia will come out of that war, will emerge from that war as a military superpower, right? Because the Russian armed forces will be more than 1 million armed forces, equipped, trained with unique military experience, and so on and so forth, right? The Russian military industrial potential will not be destroyed or diminished. The Russian military potential will be strengthened. So the Russian capacity to defend Armenia and to deter the enemies of Armenia will strengthen really much after the end of the war in Ukraine. Even before the war in Ukraine, Russia will not, of course, will not reject its alliance obligations with Armenia.
Now, I don't want to relitigate what happened in 2020, 2023. Some Armenians, even in the opposition, have questions to Russia about that. Many blame the issue on, let's say, especially what happened in Artsakh in 2023 on Russia, the Ukraine factor. But, I'm going to go back to this issue of dignity. So a new government comes to power, and it starts to assert the rights and security of refugees from Artsakh. Will Russia support this? And will Russia make it also part of the agenda between Azerbaijan and Russia? Or will Russia try to slow down Armenia? Because I think that, any dignified Armenian, you know, I have to say, my friends, some of my good friends, who every day were cleaning up the graves of their sons in Artsakh, are no longer able to do that. And putting myself in their position, I think that I have to ask that question: how can the rights and the security of Artsakh residents, including their right to live on their own homeland for thousands, which they have occupied for thousands of years, how can that be ensured in the near term or midterm? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think that Russia will be at the Armenian side on that question. From the Russian perspective, the exodus of Armenians from the Nagorno-Karabakh region was a tragedy. Russia didn't want that. Basically, Russia hoped that the status quo, which emerged in November 2020, the Sochi summit, and basically the division of the regions which you Armenians call Artsakh into something including Stepanakert, belonging to Armenians, and something belonging to Azerbaijan would be a permanent status quo without any exodus. The later developments, the conquering of Azerbaijan of the whole region, followed up by the exodus of ethnic Armenians, was against the Russian will, against the Russian efforts. Russia certainly did not facilitate that, right? Russia was against that. And Russia didn't welcome that. And of course, Russia would open the question of the refugees in its negotiations with Azerbaijan, which are troubled as well, by the way, right? And no, certainly Russia will not restrain Armenia in opening up those questions. Russia could, not, could some kind of restrain Armenia in the hypothetical efforts to reconquer the Nagorno-Karabakh if any Armenian government would want that, but I do not expect any Armenian government realistically to try to reconquer Nagorno-Karabakh with the use of force, right? But as for the humanitarian issues, the issue of the refugees from Artsakh and so on, Russia will certainly promotes their rights, and raise that issue at the agenda of Russian-Azerbaijani relations.
But okay, let me counter that because we know the militaristic posture of Azerbaijan, and we know that Pashinyan, of course, is threatening war. I don't know if he knows anything that we don't, but I think we should not underestimate the willingness of Azerbaijan to maybe it's tactical, maybe like short-term military maneuvers if it doesn't get what it wants in terms of the leadership of Armenia, right? So let's say that the chance is small, but if the opposition wins and Aliyev is demanding the change of the constitution and the opposition says no deal, and it goes to war, how far is Russia prepared to go to ensure the security of Armenia? Will it provide arms and will it even fight side by side with Armenians against the Azerbaijanis?
I have no doubts that if there is a full-blown Azerbaijani invasion against Armenia, right, and now we are no longer talking about Nagorno-Karabakh, but we're talking about Armenia proper in its international recognized borders. Now, if there is a full-blown Azerbaijani aggression against Armenia, Russia will definitely fulfill its alliance obligations, which includes, of course, any military assistance, right, to Armenia, perhaps up to joining the fight. I would not exclude that, right? And again, I would reiterate the point that those people who consider Russia to be weak, they are wrong, right? Because Russia is waging the most difficult war whatsoever now in Ukraine without a defeat, right? To put it mildly, right? And we have in unique experience. We have good weapons and many people, manpowers. And basically, the things that you are talking about reiterate the point about the necessity of deterrence, right? Because what will deter Azerbaijan from trying that full-blown invasion, if it doesn't like the outcome of the Armenian elections, is deterrence. And at this stage, the only party to provide this deterrence is Russia. This is why, of course, Armenia is interested objectively in stabilizing and normalizing the relations with Russia, again, without cutting the alternatives, of course.
Yeah.
Dr. Suslov, you noted a moment ago that the relations between Russia and Azerbaijan are not 100% great, and they haven't been great since December 2024 when that Azal flight crashed and, Ilham Aliyev took the opportunity to really deteriorate the relationship. But recently, Overchuk was in Azerbaijan and a fairly high-profile meeting that aimed to restore relations. He was also in Artsakh, and he expressed Russia's willingness to take part in reconstruction projects. How would you generally characterize Russian-Azerbaijani relations right now as both countries are trying to make up this relationship a little bit?
Well, as I said, they are troubled relations. I think that the tragedy.
Can you say more about the basis of those troubles?
Sure. I think that the accident with the tragedy with the airplane was a trigger rather than a reason for deterioration of relations. The reason is the belief of Azerbaijani leadership after the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War that now Russia needs them more than they need Russia, basically, right? That they have won, they have this euphoria of victory. They demand a new kind of the new status of Azerbaijan, including in its relations with Russia. And basically, they believe that Russia, in the current conditions, when Russia is fighting the West or fighting Europe in Ukraine with all sanctions and so on and so forth, with all the military conflict going on in Ukraine, that Russia needs them more than they need Russia, right? And this is why they afford much more offensive and not even polite, to put it mildly, rhetoric and gestures vis-a-vis Russia, including humiliating Russia. So that was the situation. However, I think with some participation of Turkey, who made it clear to Baku that even Turkey is not interested in a complete deterioration of the Russian-Azerbaijani relations and even further destabilization of the South Caucasus, the government in Baku kind of melted down its rhetorical offensive against Russia, and we have some relative stabilization without the resolution of the fundamentals, right? But relative stabilization of relations. So you rightly mentioned the Averchuk's visit to Azerbaijan. We came to kind of business as usual in the economic field of our relations, which are mutually beneficial. Because, in the beginning of our conversation, we mentioned the North-South corridor. Objectively, Azerbaijan is a part and parcel of this North-South corridor. So Russia also, of course, is interested in preservation of relatively good relations with Azerbaijan from that logistical perspective, from the perspective of sanctions, and so on and so forth. This is why there was the visits to Averchuk. Yes, we are interested in normalization of relations with Azerbaijan, but this does not reject what we discussed before. If there is a full-scale invasion of Azerbaijan in Armenia, Russia will sacrifice its relations with Azerbaijan for the sake of its alliance obligations with Armenia.
Understood. Yeah. When we talk about Overchuk visiting Artsakh and declaring Russia's readiness to participate in restoration, reconstruction, and we are seeing the destruction of Armenian and Christian heritage. The last of it is a church in Stepanakert, which was inaugurated in 2019, has been completely wiped out. Does Russia take into account the destruction of such heritage in its conversations with Azerbaijan? In what way?
Of course, I think that the implicit message in Russian offer to participate in reconstruction was basically Russian interest in protection of that cultural Christian heritage, right? Because, yeah, you're absolutely right. The Nagorno-Karabakh is has one of the most ancient monasteries and churches in the world. This is part
Absolutely.
of the Christian heritage. And Russia, of course, does not want that to be destroyed completely. Russia wants that to be protected, and perhaps Russian participation in some reconstruction of the region could ensure that.
Hmm. Okay, well, thank you for all this time for us, Dr. Suslov. I have one last question before we let you go, if that's okay. Um,
Absolutely, yes.
so we earlier this year, I believe, we had Professor Andrei Tsigankov on our podcast, and according to him, Russia essentially in the mid 2010s turned to the idea of this state civilization as a transnational concept that helps combat ethno-nationalism and separatist pressures that were present at the time and crop up from time to time. Now, Russian theorists have developed that idea further into this concept of Eurasianism, which is, I guess, opposed to the Slavic Orthodox civilization model proposed by Huntington in his
Mhm.
Clash of Civilizations. Can we get your take on what is Eurasianism and what role do you see Armenia playing? Because, we hear a lot of things that, I mean, Armenia is already, of course, getting a lot of economic benefits from its relationship with Russia, and we're hearing about if Armenia goes towards the west, then they will be cut off. But what is a better future in terms of this Eurasianism, if you believe in that, or how do you believe the region will be reorganized in the future? And what is Armenia's role in the region?
Sure. Well, let me say several things. First, the Russian civilization approach is very different from Huntingtonian one, right? Because Samuel Huntington was talking about clash of civilizations.
Yes.
Russia is talking about partnership of civilizations, right? Russia
Mhm.
claims that the relations between different civilizations should be harmonious unless one civilization tries to impose itself against the other. Secondly, Russia, of course, now proclaims itself officially as a country civilization, right? Well, first, we no longer consider ourselves to be part of the Western civilization or Western civilizations due to the fact that their cultural evolution, value evolution is different from what we value, and because we are at the state of hybrid war and could turn into the hot war with the West and with Europe. Also, we try to define ourselves, because Russia is not a nation state in the classical European understanding of that term. At the same time, it would probably be politically incorrect and not nice to define ourselves as empire. So we found some alternative in the form of country civilization, right? This is more than a nation state, right? Which is basically what Russia is. Russia is more than a nation state. And this country civilization should not be in the state of confrontation or in this Huntingtonian clash with the other civilizations, but on the contrary, we want cooperation, even integration, and partnership with the other civilizations. And the cooperation of Eurasian players and Eurasian civilizations create Eurasia, greater Eurasia. So contemporary Russian Eurasian is also very much different from the Gumilyov's Eurasianism of the early 20th century, and very different from Zhirinovsky's Eurasianism, which was the imperial expansion whatsoever in Eurasia. Today, by Eurasianism, Russia claims that basically Eurasia is the greatest continent in the world. And Eurasian countries are objectively interested in peace, in having peaceful relations among them, in facilitation of economic cooperation between them. And we are not interested in divisions and confrontations within Eurasia. So the Russian Eurasianism entails that, right? And of course, this Russian Eurasianism is the alternative to the European choice, which was the Russian choice in the previous times, right? We no longer choose Europe. We consider Europe to be a periphery of the world rather than the centerpiece. So Eurasia is much more central, and Eurasia is the region where Russia is central, where Russia is the region, one of the leaders, one of the poles of integration. And I mean, it is also not confrontational. It is not against anyone else. It is in favor of cooperation, stability, and security. This is why Russia is talking about actually Eurasian security system, which needs to be indivisible, and so on and so forth. You know, as for Armenia, so far Armenia is a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. And Eurasian Economic Union is one of the pillars of what Russia considers to be Greater Eurasia. So Armenia already now is an inherent participant of this Greater Eurasia. Again, it is not Russian Eurasianism. It is a Greater Eurasia as a geo-economic community, right? Which is created by the Eurasian Economic Union, by China, by Iran, by the Eurasian players. But this Greater Eurasian partnership is not isolated and must not be isolated from the rest of the world, and must not be in the state of confrontation with the rest of the world. Actually, when Russia talks about Greater Eurasian partnership, it always emphasizes that it is open for Europe, even open for Europe if Europe rejects the current confrontational approach vis-a-vis Russia. So this is why Armenian relations with the European Union, again, cooperation and partnership relations between Armenia and the European Union do not contradict Armenian participation in the Eurasian processes as a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. But what Armenia, from the Russian perspective, should not do is to switch sides, right? It should not try to integrate into the European Union as a full member or associated member, because that, in the given the current policy of the European Union vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis Eurasia, by the way, European Union does not want Eurasia to exist, this Greater Eurasia. European Union wants the Eurasian countries to be periphery of the EU. Right. Given the current policy of the European Union, of course, Armenian choice in favor of the EU would contradict and cannot coexist the Armenian participation in the Eurasian Economic Union and in the creation of Greater Eurasia.
Dr. Suslov, what a fantastic conversation and discussion here. I'm already looking forward to our next time with you on our show. Thank you so much for joining us. I thoroughly enjoyed your insight.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Good to be with you. Goodbye.
That's our show today, recorded on April 24, 2026.
And this day is special for Armenians. It is Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day. And I just want to say on behalf of Groong that we remember, and more importantly, we demand.
Yes, absolutely. We've been talking with Dr. Dmitry Suslov, who is a Russian political scientist, foreign policy analyst, and commentator specializing in great power politics, especially Russia-US relations, European security, and the evolving international order. He serves as deputy director of the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. He's also affiliated with the Valtai Discussion Club. For more information, you can go to our website and click on the links, podcasts.groong.org/episode number.
Okay, folks, very quickly, support us by subscribing, commenting, liking, sharing, hitting the bell icon, and also monetarily by going to podcasts.groong.org/donate. All of that is much appreciated. We hope that you are interested by the content we're working on and come back again in the future. I'm Hovik Manucharyan.
And I'm Asbet Bedrosyan in Los Angeles. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.